I want to help create a generation of kids who do not have to recover from their childhood. What's up? It's Candace from Gigglezilla.com, and I am passionate about helping parents and caregivers build a toolkit that they can use to take care of their kids. Today's toolkit subject is the impact of childhood trauma. This subject is so near and dear to my heart. And I know this is not an easy thing to talk about because either you have experienced trauma or you have seen the impact of trauma. Some people just aren't ready to deal with that. I get it. My family, my immediate family, and my family history is littered with childhood trauma. I mean, you name it, it has happened in my family. And I mean like everything from murder to incest and everything in between, okay? It's not right. And I now know that we have the power to change the trajectory. We have the power to change the outcome of kids' lives by our own choices, by how we parent them, by how we interact with them, okay? There's a lot of talk about trauma right now. I see it in the media. I see schools using trauma-informed practices. It's showing up in conversations that I have with my friends and family. So the definition of trauma is a deeply disturbing experience. And what I want to talk about today specifically is a traumatic childhood. So what that means is those deeply disturbing or distressing experiences keep occurring. They keep happening over and over and over again, creating what we would call a traumatic childhood. So let's take this back just a little bit. So there's a part of your brain called the amygdala. So let's say my fist, can it focus? I don't know if it's focused or not. Sorry if I'm ashy. I put some Vaseline on, but it don't always work. Okay, say this is your amygdala, okay? Your amygdala stays closed like this. You have a traumatic experience. It triggers something called fight or flight. When that happens, it triggers your amygdala. So your amygdala goes like this. You now have to decide, am I gonna fight or am I gonna run? Okay, that's what happens to your brain. When it's not in that mode, it closes like this. You can make rational decisions, you can control your emotions and so on, right? If a child experiences something traumatic, boom, that amygdala thing is open, right? Okay, now they gotta decide, am I gonna fight or am I gonna flight? Imagine if in their childhood, this keeps happening. Childhood abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, abandonment. It just keeps going like this, open, close, right? Eventually, that child has a hard time figuring out how to close this. This is related to control and your emotions, okay? If this thing is constantly open, you have a really hard time controlling your emotions. Those are just a few of the things that happen to the child's brain when they are constantly exposed to trauma. So if they're constantly exposed to trauma, there's a thing called ACE, A-C-E, Adverse Childhood Experience. And the more of those ACEs you have, the higher your ACE score. The more adverse childhood experience you have, the more traumatic they would classify your childhood as being. The way that this shows up in behavior is the child may have poor decision-making skills. They have a hard time with self-regulation. They can become very aggressive. They may even turn to drugs and alcohol because that's a numbing effect, so they don't have to think about the trauma that they are experiencing. This may also show up in their cognition. This child may have language delays. They may also have a hard time concentrating. So physically, how does trauma impact children? They could have a sleep disorder. They could develop an eating disorder. They typically have a shorter lifespan, or they have cardiovascular issues into their adulthood. What happens up here physically affects your body. And we already talked about this a little bit, but emotionally, that child may walk around with a lot of shame. They may walk around with a lot of guilt. They may be reclusive and not want to talk to people or not want to interact or not want to play with their friends. Emotionally, they may not feel like life is worth living because what they are experiencing or have experienced could just be that terrible to them, not knowing that it will get better. The final way that I want to talk about the impact of childhood trauma is in relationships. And if I look at the trauma that I experienced personally and how that impacted my relationships, I had a really hard time forming relationships with my friends and maintaining those relationships with my friends. I specifically had a really hard time having a relationship with men, trusting people, specifically men, being vulnerable with people because I feel like they're going to take advantage of me or abuse me in some way. Another way that this can show up is intergenerational cycles of abuse. So your grandpa was abused, so then he abused, and then the person that he abused, and then the abuse and the neglect just continues. And that's really why I'm so fired up about this, because I just feel like we have to stop it. Like the buck has to stop somewhere. This trauma, this abuse, this neglect that these kids are experiencing has to stop. Enough is enough. And the first way that we can stop the trauma, stop the buck, is to recognize how it impacted us. Recognize how it shows up in our life every single day. Recognize how it shows up in our decision making and our interactions with our kids. Our kids need to be put on a path that is different than the one that we experienced if our path involved a lot of trauma. Some people grew up with wonderful childhoods. They do not have adverse childhood experiences. They were not traumatized. That is absolutely wonderful. That is absolutely a blessing. And I hope to pass that on to my child. And I hope that anybody watching this desires the same for their kid. If you grew up without trauma, be an advocate to those that did, support those that did, find out how you can help and be a friend to people who have experienced a lot of trauma. And if nothing else, you'll gain a better understanding of why they are the way that they are. My mom always says, you know better, you do better. We know what trauma means. We now know the impact of trauma on our mind, on our body, on our relationships. Now we have a calling to do better. All of the things discussed in this video are the reason why I'm so passionate about trauma. Think about the impact trauma has on that child, on their brain, on their ability to make decisions, on how they interact with others, on how they see their self, on whether they think life is worth going on or not. Sometimes your kids don't tell you that they are having terrible thoughts about their self. They just keep going because it's so normal for them to be traumatized. But we have to do better. Our kids should not be thinking these thoughts about their self based on an action that we have done to them. Okay, it's already hard enough to be a teenager and to be going through life in the world that we live in right now. I don't want to add anything else to that. I don't want to rub salt in the wounds. I want to be support to my kid, and I want to love them, and I want to do better. I want to stop the buck. My mom did the best that she could do. She didn't have trauma-informed practices. Generational trauma and neglect got passed down from her. So she did the best that she could to love us and to take good care of us. And now I will take that baton and I will continue running with it, and I will do better. The seriousness of this conversation is the reason I'm so passionate about helping parents and caregivers build out that toolkit so that they can take better care of their kids. If you found any value in this video at all, I know it's a heavy subject. It's heavy, but it's necessary. And if you found any value in it, subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button so that I can continue to put out more videos like this that help people heal from their trauma, recognize their trauma, and just do the best they can do to love these kids. You heard me talking? I sound good?
You sound real good.
Hey, 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 hey.